They won't be visiting you anymore." My daughter-in-law's voice cut through the phone, cold and sharp. "Not until you show that you actually care about this family's future." By care, she meant my money, and by family, she meant her extravagant lifestyle. My name is Beverly, and for years they saw me as just a quiet widow in a modest house, an easy source of cash, and an obstacle to their inheritance. What they didn't realize was that the lonely old woman they were blackmailing with my own grandchildren held the keys to their entire financial world, and I was about to change the locks. Have you ever been pushed to your absolute limit by the people you're supposed to trust the most? Tell me your story in the comments below. The silence in the children's room was the first thing that struck me. It wasn't peaceful, but an alarming, hollow void that seemed to absorb all the sound in the house. On any other Saturday morning, this space would be alive with the chaotic symphony of my grandchildren, Leo and Maya, the clatter of building blocks, the whispered plots of a secret mission, the joyful shrieks that were the soundtrack of my life. Instead, the fresh, crisp sheets on their twin beds lay unnaturally smooth. The stack of picture books on the nightstand remained an undisturbed tower, and the faint, clean scent of lemon polish hung in the air, a testament to a welcome that would not be received. I walked over to the window and ran a hand over the bright red finish of a wooden fire truck parked on the sill. Its ladder extended as if in mid-rescue. My late husband, Arthur, had carved it himself for Leo's 5th birthday. His knuckles raw and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose for a week straight as he meticulously sanded every edge. Arthur always had a way of seeing the true grain of people, just as he did with wood. "Be careful of people who only see the value of the gift, Beverly," he'd told me once, holding up the finished toy with a quiet pride, "and not the love that went into it." His words, which I had dismissed at the time as his usual gentle cynicism, now echoed with a chilling prescience. Leaving the quiet room behind, I returned to the kitchen, the heart of my modest 2-story home in the suburbs of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The warm, sweet aroma of oatmeal raisin cookies, the kids' absolute favorite, filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold knot forming in my stomach. I had been up since 5 a.m., mixing the dough from scratch, just as my own mother had taught me. It was a ritual of love, a simple offering for the 2 small people who were the center of my universe. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:15. They should have been here by now, their little faces pressed against the car windows, their voices calling for me before the engine was even off. But as the clock's hands ticked past 9:30, the hope I'd been nursing all morning began to curdle into a familiar, heavy disappointment. The phone rang at precisely 9:45. I knew before I answered. "Mom," Jacob's voice was distant, rushed, the words already sounding tired. "Something's come up at work, a last-minute deadline. The client is flying in this afternoon. We can't make it today." The kids are so disappointed. I heard the practiced flatness in his tone, the hollow shell of an excuse he'd used too many times before. Before I could voice my own disappointment, he'd already moved on. "I'll have Sarah call you in a bit. Love you." The line went dead before I could say it back. Not 60 seconds later, the phone rang again. "Beverly, honey, I am so sorry." Sarah's voice was a confection of sweetness and performative apology. "Jacob is just swamped. He feels terrible. And to make matters worse, you know that advanced placement program I told you about for Maya? The one for gifted young artists? They had a last-minute opening, but the tuition deposit is due by noon today. It's just a small loan, really. We'll pay you back next month, I promise." I sank into a kitchen chair, the disappointment a physical weight. It was always a small loan, always for the children's future, always an emergency that coincided perfectly with a canceled visit. My own frugal habits flashed through my mind, the tea bags I used twice, the sweaters I'd mended season after season. But the thought of Maya, my bright, creative granddaughter, missing an opportunity, even a vaguely described one, was a manipulation I was not yet strong enough to resist. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice thin. "Anything for Maya's future." I walked to the old desktop computer in the corner of my living room and, with a few reluctant clicks, made the transfer, telling myself it was the right thing to do. As the confirmation page loaded, a new email popped up in my inbox, an alert from my bank about Jacob's credit card statement. It was an automated service I'd set up years ago when he was in college, a safety net I'd never thought to remove. I opened it out of habit, my eyes scanning the list of transactions. And then I saw it. A charge from the previous night, Friday, October 13th, at a high-end steakhouse in Boston's Seaport District that I knew was famous for its wine list and waterfront views. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the number on the bill, a figure large enough to cover my home's utilities for an entire year. $475. And then I wondered, just how expensive was Maya's gifted program really? My grandson's birthday party should have been filled with laughter, but the air in Jacob and Sarah's rented house was thick with calculation. The home itself was a monument to their aspirations, all stark white walls, minimalist furniture, and cavernous ceilings that echoed with the polite, hollow chatter of strangers. It was a space designed to be photographed, not lived in, a world away from the comfortable, worn-in love of my own home. I felt like a visitor from another planet, clad in my simple, practical dress, a relic of a bygone era. I stood at the edge of the living room, clutching the pirate ship I'd spent the last month crafting in Arthur's old workshop. Its tiny cannons were meticulously turned on the lathe. Its sails were hand-stitched from a piece of an old linen shirt, and it smelled faintly of sawdust and varnish. It was a piece of my heart, a piece of his grandfather. Leo's eyes lit up for a fraction of a second when he saw it, a flicker of the boy I knew. But Sarah, ever the conductor of her perfect social orchestra, quickly steered him toward a mountain of glossy boxes. "Look, sweetie, Uncle Robert got you the new GameSphere console. Isn't that what you wanted?" The wooden ship was unceremoniously placed on a side table, a handmade artifact in a sea of blinking plastic and corporate logos, already forgotten. Sarah's mother, Eleanor, drifted over to me, a glass of champagne held delicately in her perfectly manicured hand. She ran a finger over the simple silver locket I wore, a gift from Arthur on our 20th anniversary. "That's lovely, Beverly. It must be quite valuable," she said, her eyes not admiring but appraising, like a pawnbroker assessing an item for quick sale. I instinctively touched the cool metal, Arthur's warning from years ago surfacing in my mind, as clear as if he were whispering in my ear. He once told me about Eleanor after a particularly cloying family dinner. She has the smile of a crocodile that's just been fed. I thought he was just being cynical back then. The conversation soon turned, as it always did when Eleanor was present, to real estate. She and Sarah stood near the large picture window, scrolling through listings on an iPad, their voices pitched just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Look at this brownstone in Beacon Hill, darling," Eleanor cooed, pointing at the screen. "Imagine the children growing up there. The right schools, the right connections. It's an investment in their entire future." They both glanced in my direction, a silent, heavy expectation hanging in the air. This was not a conversation, it was a performance. A carefully staged presentation, and I was the sole intended audience. A few minutes later, Jacob cornered me by the kitchen island, his posture tense and his eyes avoiding mine. "Mom," he started, fidgeting with his cufflink, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. "We found an incredible investment opportunity, a real family home, somewhere the kids can put down roots." He talked about long-term growth and building equity, words that sounded rehearsed and foreign coming from my son, who used to speak of building forts, not portfolios. "We were hoping you'd be willing to help out, significantly." I looked at his strained face, the face of a man being pulled in two directions, a man losing a war within himself. I thought of the $400 steak dinner, of the endless, small loans. I needed time. Jacob, that's a very big decision, I began, my voice softer than I intended. I'll have to think about it. Before he could respond, Sarah materialized at his side, her smile as sharp and cold as glass. Mother, she said, the word dripping with a condescending finality. This isn't something to think about. This is your grandchildren's future. Her words were a slap, a final dismissal of my role as anything other than a financial resource. Before I could find my voice, she scooped Maya into her arms, turning away as if the conversation was already over. Grandma seems tired, sweetie, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. We should give her some space. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. The call came on a Tuesday evening, and my daughter-in-law's voice was as sweet as honey-laced poison. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern, a shoebox of old photographs open on my lap. The house was quiet, filled with the long shadows of twilight. My fingers traced the faded, glossy image of a 7-year-old Jacob, grinning with a missing front tooth, his arm slung around my shoulder at a long-forgotten county fair. A wave of nostalgia, sharp and painful, washed over me. For a moment, he was my little boy again, the one who believed his mother could fix anything. Beverly, honey, how are you feeling? Sarah began, her tone dripping with a practiced concern I now knew was counterfeit. Jacob and I were just worried you seemed a little down at the party on Saturday. We want to make sure you're okay. For a fleeting second, I almost believed her, the mother in me desperately wanting to. But then I remembered what Arthur used to say about her mother, Eleanor, after she'd spent an entire family dinner sizing up our silverware. She has the smile of a crocodile that's just been fed, he'd murmur with a knowing look. I thought he was just being cynical back then. Now I saw the inherited trait in his daughter's saccharine voice. The pleasantries were fleeting, a thin veil for the true purpose of her call. Listen, she said, her voice shifting, becoming brisk and efficient. The reason I'm calling is that the realtor for that dream house got back to us. They have another offer, a serious one. We need to give them our answer and our deposit by tomorrow morning, so we really need your decision on the financial support right away. A cold dread crept up my spine, chilling me more than the autumn air outside. This was it. Final push. My hand, hidden from the receiver, reached for my smartphone on the end table. My fingers, surprisingly steady after the turmoil of the past few days, swiped the screen and pressed the red record icon. It was a desperate, instinctive act, a need for proof, a shield against the gaslighting I knew was coming. Sarah, I said, trying to keep my voice even, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. This is a life-altering amount of money. I can't possibly make a decision like this over the phone on a Tuesday night. The warmth in her voice evaporated instantly, replaced by an Arctic chill that mirrored the one in my heart. Fine, she snapped, the single word sharp enough to cut. Then I'm sorry, Beverly. We feel it would be best for the children not to be exposed to this kind of negativity and selfishness. They won't be visiting you anymore, not until you decide to show that you actually care about this family's future. The click was followed by a dial tone that droned on in the silent room, a long, empty sound. I sat there in the growing darkness, the phone still pressed to my ear, the recording silently saved. For the first time in years, I felt a cold, hard anger begin to rise from the depths of my pain. Pain has a strange power. It can either drown you or force you to stand up. That night, sitting in the deafening silence left by Sarah's ultimatum, I chose to stand. The tears had dried on my cheeks, leaving behind a tight, cold mask. For hours, I wandered the familiar halls of my home, a ghost in my own life. Each step echoed with the profound absence of my grandchildren, a silence more painful than any shouting match. I paused at the door to their room, the one I always kept ready for them. a cheerful space filled with books and handmade toys. The little beds were perfectly made. The wooden pirate ship Arthur had built for Leo stood sentinel on the dresser, its tiny flag pointing toward a window that showed only darkness. Seeing it, a fresh wave of grief washed over me, but it was quickly consumed by a current of cold, hard fury. The sadness was still there, a deep ache in my bones, but now it had a purpose. It was fuel. I walked into Arthur's old study, a room I had kept largely untouched since he passed 5 years ago. The air was thick with the comforting scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and his quiet strength. This wasn't a place for mourning anymore. It was a war room. My mission was clear. I needed to understand what I was up against. I needed a plan, a strategy. Arthur had been a chess player, a man who thought 10 moves ahead. I needed to learn to think like him. On the mahogany desk, beside his collection of antique maps, sat a small carved wooden box where he kept his most important papers. I opened it, my fingers trembling as they sifted through a life's worth of documents. Old deeds, insurance policies, his honorable discharge papers from the Army. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe just a piece of his guidance, a sign of what to do. He was a planner, a man who always had a backup for his backup. Surely he had left me something. And then I found it. Tucked in an old leather-bound address book was a business card, its edges soft and yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. Davies and Associates, Family Law, it read, with an address in Beacon Hill I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered the name vaguely. Arthur had mentioned him a few times, a trusted friend from his early business days, a man he respected for his sharp mind and unwavering loyalty. Behind the card, a small folded piece of notepaper caught my eye. Arthur's familiar, steady handwriting filled the small square. If trouble comes, call him. He knows everything. A sense of profound relief, the first I'd felt in days, washed through me. This was it. This was the guidance I had been looking for. Arthur, even from beyond, was still taking care of me. I took the card and my phone, my hands now steady. It was well past midnight, the digital clock on the desk glowing 1 a.m., but I didn't care. I dialed the number, my heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs. As I expected, it went to voicemail. I took a deep, fortifying breath before speaking, the words coming out clear and unwavering. "Hello, Mr. Davies. This is Beverly Hayes, Arthur's wife. I need your help, urgently." I hung up, a sense of resolve settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in Arthur's chair until the first light of dawn streamed into the kitchen. I was making a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me, when my old computer chimed with a new notification. I walked over, my mug warming my hands. An email sat in my inbox. The subject line read, "Re Arthur Hayes Estate." The sender was Jonathan Davies. Mr. Davies's office was in Beacon Hill, a world of quiet wealth and old power I had deliberately forgotten. The taxi dropped me off on a cobblestone street lined with flickering gas lamps and elegant brick townhouses that seemed to lean together, sharing centuries of secrets. Pushing open the heavy oak door to his firm felt like stepping back in time, into a life Arthur and I had consciously left behind in favor of something simpler, something we thought was more real. The air inside smelled of old leather, polished wood, and the faint, crisp scent of important paper. A polite receptionist, who looked no older than my granddaughter Maya, led me to a corner office overlooking the Boston Common. The man who stood to greet me was older than I remembered from the few times I'd met him at Arthur's company events, his hair now a distinguished silver, but his eyes were just as sharp, missing nothing. He was Jonathan Davies. On the wall behind his sprawling mahogany desk hung a framed photograph of him and Arthur on a fishing boat somewhere off the coast of Maine, grinning at the camera, holding up a ridiculously large fish between them. They looked like brothers. I knew I had come to the right place. Beverly. he said, his voice warm but professional, a stark contrast to the cloying tones I'd grown used to. "It has been too long. Please sit." I took the leather chair opposite him, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. For the next 20 minutes, the story poured out of me, the constant, escalating financial requests, the thinly veiled insults about my home and my life, Leo's birthday party where my handmade gift was cast aside, and finally, Sarah's cruel ultimatum over the phone. I told him I had recorded it. His expression never changed, but his eyes darkened with a sad, knowing anger that told me he was not surprised. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, letting the weight of my words settle in the quiet room. Then he rose and walked to a large, imposing safe, tucked behind a bookshelf filled with leather-bound legal texts. He spun the dial with a practiced ease and pulled out a thick, heavy portfolio stamped with the initials A.H. "Arthur was a brilliant man, Beverly," he said, placing the file on the desk between us with a soft, definitive thud. "He was also a cautious one. He asked me to keep this for you, to be opened only if you ever felt the family was under threat." He opened the portfolio. Inside were documents I had never seen, their crispness a testament to how long they had been kept hidden. Stock certificates, deeds to commercial properties downtown that I never knew we owned, and statements for investment accounts that had been quietly growing for decades. He explained Arthur's wish for us to live simply, to protect our son from the poison of unearned wealth, a lesson he feared Jacob had never learned. He then turned to the final page, a summary of the current total assets. My eyes scanned the number, a figure with so many commas it seemed unreal, and the air left my lungs in a quiet gasp. It was not just a comfortable nest egg, it was a fortune. Mr. Davies closed the file gently. He wanted Jacob to learn the value of work, not the weight of an inheritance. It seems that lesson was lost. He looked at me, his gaze firm and reassuring. "We will protect you, and we will protect Arthur's legacy. I suggest we hire a private financial investigator. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with, their debts, their assets, their entire financial picture. We need facts, not just feelings." I nodded, feeling a surge of strength I hadn't felt in years. He leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Arthur anticipated this, Beverly. He sat in this very chair 2 months before he passed and made me promise. He said, 'I hope I am wrong, John, but if I am right, you protect her.'" Tears pricked my eyes, tears of gratitude for the man I had loved and lost. "Now," Mr. Davies said, his tone shifting back to one of pure strategy, "go home. Answer their calls. Act as if nothing has happened. Let them think they are winning." Playing a part is exhausting, especially when your only audience is the ones plotting against you. For 3 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation, the investigators' silent work a promise unfolding somewhere in the city's shadows. I spent my time pretending that my world hadn't been shattered. When the phone rang, I learned to let it ring 3 times before answering, cultivating an air of weary reluctance. I answered their calls with a practiced, fragile sigh, letting them believe their emotional siege was slowly grinding me down. Jacob called on Friday afternoon, his voice oozing a counterfeit remorse that was almost convincing. "Mom, I am so sorry about Sarah. She's just been so stressed with the house hunt and everything. She didn't mean it the way it came out." I almost believed him. The mother in me, the foolish, hopeful part I thought had died, desperately wanting to. But then, in the background, a sound as faint and sharp as a needle, I heard the whisper of Eleanor, Sarah's mother. "Ask her if she's decided yet." The illusion shattered. He was not calling out of concern. He was calling to check on the status of his investment. "I'm still thinking, Jacob," I said softly, playing my role to perfection. "It's a lot to consider. It's my entire future." My performance was apparently not convincing enough for Sarah. She called an hour later, her tone brisk and impatient, dispensing with Jacob's pretense of an apology. "Beverly, we need to meet. This back and forth on the phone isn't productive. We need to talk face to face." We agreed on a small, neutral cafe in Harvard Square for the following morning, a place bustling with students and anonymous enough for a tense family negotiation. The cafe was crowded, the air thick with the smell of roasted coffee and the low hum of 100 conversations. Sarah arrived 10 minutes late, sweeping in with an air of importance, dressed in an expensive-looking trench coat I suspected I had inadvertently paid for. She skipped the pleasantries, getting straight to the point as soon as her latte arrived. "So," she said, stirring the foam with a frantic, tapping energy, "what's the number? How much are you willing to put down for the house?" Her impatience was a weapon, designed to make me feel flustered, old, and inadequate. She pushed a glossy brochure for the Beacon Hill property across the table, its perfect facade a picture of the life she felt she was owed. "The sellers won't wait forever, Beverly." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my chamomile tea, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for her. I looked at this woman who saw my life savings as her personal slush fund, who wielded my own grandchildren like a bargaining chip. The anger was a cold, steady flame inside me. "It's not about a simple number, Sarah," I said, my voice deliberately fragile, laced with a new, thoughtful hesitation. "I've been thinking about the future, about Leo and Maya. A simple down payment feels short-sighted." I saw a flicker of confusion, then intense curiosity in her eyes. I leaned in, lowering my voice conspiratorially, as if sharing a great secret. "I was speaking to a financial advisor, someone Arthur trusted. He suggested something more permanent, something to protect the children's future no matter what happens. I feel I need to consult with my family lawyer about setting up a proper family trust." The effect was instantaneous. The words lawyer and family trust were like a magic spell. The impatience in Sarah's eyes was replaced by a brilliant, predatory gleam. A trust implied a structure, a formal fund, something far larger and more significant than a one-time payment. She thought she was about to gain control of the entire pot of gold. Her entire demeanor changed. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a matching conspiratorial whisper. "Of course, Beverly," she said, her smile wide and, for the first time, seemingly genuine. "That's brilliant. A trust is the perfect way to handle it. It's so responsible of you." "Wonderful, Mother," Sarah said, her hand covering mine on the table, her touch feeling like a spider's caress. "Let's set up a meeting with your lawyer as soon as possible." She had no idea she was eagerly walking into a trap of her own making. The truth, when presented as cold, hard numbers on paper, is more terrifying than any accusation. The confidential manila envelope arrived by courier on a Thursday morning. It felt heavy in my hands, a dense weight of secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to bear. I took it into Arthur's study, the one room in the house that still felt like a sanctuary, and closed the door. The air was still, holding the faint, comforting scent of his books. It was the last moment of peace I would know for a long time. I slit the envelope open with a letter opener. Inside was a neatly bound report from the financial investigator Mr. Davies had hired. I sat in Arthur's worn leather chair and began to read. The first few pages were a cascade of financial devastation. Jacob and Sarah weren't just struggling, they were drowning. Their combined credit card debt totaled over $120,000. There were personal loans from 3 different online lenders, each with predatory interest rates. They were 4 months behind on the rent for their luxury apartment. The sleek German SUV Jacob drove was on the verge of being repossessed. My mind flashed back to all the designer items Sarah had casually flaunted, always with a story of a miraculous sale or a generous gift. I remembered a particular handbag she'd shown me a few months ago, claiming she'd found it at an outlet for a steal. The report included a credit card statement showing the full four-figure price, purchased from a boutique on Newbury Street the very day after I'd sent money for what she called emergency dental work. The lies weren't just lies. They were a calculated system, my generosity their operating budget. But the financial figures were not the sharpest cut. That came in the second half of the report. The investigator had discovered that Sarah had been laid off from her marketing job 6 months ago. 6 months. For half a year, she'd been pretending to go to work every day, a complete fabrication while I continued to send her money for work-related expenses. The final, most sickening discovery was a series of bank transfers from Sarah's account to her mother, Eleanor's. The memo line on each one simply read, "Gift." They were substantial amounts, thousands of dollars, transferred within days of my own deposits into their account. They hadn't just been using my money to fund their lifestyle, they were redistributing it to their extended family. Then, I saw it. The last page of the report was a printed copy of an email, forwarded from an anonymous source the investigator had cultivated. It was from Sarah to Eleanor, dated the week before. I had to read it 3 times before the words fully registered, burning themselves into my memory. As soon as the old woman signs the papers for the trust, all our problems will be solved. We just have to keep her thinking it's for the kids. I folded the report and placed it back in the envelope. The anger I had felt before was a hot, messy thing. This was different. My pain and fury had crystallized into something else entirely. It had turned to ice, cold, sharp, and unshakable. It was time to arrange the meeting. I picked up the phone, my voice so calm it frightened even me, and invited them to the execution of their financial future. It was a Friday afternoon, precisely 1 week after Sarah's ultimatum. I had let them stew in their victory for 7 days, a small eternity for the desperate, letting them believe my silence was the slow crack of a dam about to break in their favor. I dialed Jacob's number first. He answered on the second ring, his voice guarded, laced with a nervous anticipation. "Mom?" "Jacob," I began, my tone measured and serene, the sound of calm surrender. "I've had some time to think, and I've spoken with my lawyer. I am ready to discuss the terms of my assistance." I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by a muffled sound as he covered the receiver. The whisper was indistinct, but the emotion was not. "She's ready," he said excitedly to someone in the room with him. He came back on the line, his voice thick with a relief so profound it was almost comical. "Mom, that's wonderful news. We knew you'd come around. We were so worried about you." "Yes, well," I continued, pressing the advantage, "this involves a significant amount of assets, and my lawyer, Mr. Davies, insists that everything be handled formally and legally, to protect everyone's interests, of course." I let the phrase "significant assets" hang in the air, a piece of irresistible bait. I proposed a formal meeting at his office the following Wednesday to finalize the necessary paperwork. I made sure to make it sound both complex and official, an event of great financial magnitude. Suddenly, another voice was on the line, breathless and high-pitched. Sarah had clearly snatched the phone from him. "Beverly, that is the most fantastic news. Jacob just told me. A formal meeting is perfect." When I mentioned the need to structure things properly through the Hayes Family Trust, I could practically hear the triumphant cheer in her voice. The bait, so carefully laid in that cafe, had been devoured whole. "Oh, absolutely," she chirped, her voice a giddy, unrestrained rush. "A trust is so smart. It protects everyone. In fact, my mother, Eleanor, has been helping us look into these things. She's so knowledgeable about family finances. Would it be all right if she joined us? Just to help us understand everything." A slow, cold smile touched my lips, a smile she couldn't see. They were walking into the cage and asking to bring a friend. "Of course, Sarah," I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that mirrored her own poison. "Please bring her. The more the merrier. "We will be there, thank you, Beverly, thank you. You won't regret this." "No," I said, my voice dropping slightly, the warmth gone, replaced by something hard and final. "I don't believe I will." I paused, letting the silence hang for a beat, a silent punctuation to the sentence I had just passed. "Make sure you are all present. This will be a meeting that none of us will ever forget." After I hung up, I walked to the large window in Arthur's study. The sky over Boston was a bruised purple, the clouds heavy and dark, pressing down on the city. A storm was coming. They walked into the conference room like royalty arriving for a coronation, completely unaware they were stepping onto a scaffold. I'd been there for 30 minutes, sitting in the heavy silence beside Mr. Davies, watching the rain begin to streak the tall plate glass windows. The city of Boston below was a panorama of wet slate and muted colors, a fitting backdrop for the somber business at hand. This was his domain. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the somber gray sky, flanked by imposing leather chairs that seemed to swallow you whole. It was a space designed to intimidate, radiating an unassailable authority that I was now borrowing for the afternoon. Their arrival shattered the quiet. Sarah led the charge, a whirlwind of feigned warmth and expensive perfume that did little to mask the triumphant glint in her eyes. "Jonathan, so wonderful to finally meet you in person," she gushed, extending a perfectly manicured hand to Mr. Davies, offering me only a cursory, victorious nod. Jacob trailed behind her, a shadow in a well-tailored suit that seemed too big for him. He offered a curt nod and a weak, clammy handshake to his father's old friend, his eyes darting around the room, landing everywhere but on my face. And then came Eleanor. She wore a Chanel suit that was almost certainly a knockoff, the fabric just a little too stiff, the buttons a little too bright, but she carried herself with the arrogance of the real thing. Her gaze swept across the expensive furnishings, the antique law books lining the walls, and finally settled on me. A small, triumphant smirk tugged at her lips, a look that screamed, "See, in the end you had to fold." I remained silent, a statue carved from grief and resolve. I offered only a slight, neutral inclination of my head as they took their seats opposite us. My silence, I had decided, was my new armor. Let them fill the void with their own assumptions. It seemed to unnerve Jacob, who began to fidget with his tie, but Sarah and Eleanor were practically vibrating with a predatory excitement, their chairs pulled up close to the table as if they were about to be served a feast. Mr. Davies let the silence stretch for a moment longer, a subtle display of control before he began. His voice was calm and steady, filling the room with a gravitas they clearly had not anticipated. "We are gathered today," he started, his hands steepled before him, his gaze sweeping over the three of them, "to discuss the legacy of Arthur Hayes and the future of his estate. Arthur, as I'm sure you appreciate, believed deeply in the value of hard work. He also believed in the importance of protecting his family from the complications that great wealth can sometimes bring." He let the words hang in the air, a subtle indictment that flew right over their heads. He then reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, professionally bound document, its cover embossed in gold leaf. He slid it across the vast expanse of the table. "To that end, I have drafted a preliminary outline for the Hayes Family Trust, a legal instrument designed to provide for the family for generations to come." I watched as Sarah and Eleanor leaned forward in perfect, greedy unison, their eyes devouring the title page as if it were a winning lottery ticket. They saw the words "trust fund" and immediately envisioned a bottomless well of cash, their financial problems evaporating into thin air. They didn't even bother to open it. The title was enough. Jacob, however, looked pale, swallowing hard, as if the formality of the situation, the sheer weight of the room, was finally making him realize the gravity of his choices. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, couldn't stand the suspense. She waved a dismissive hand at the document she hadn't read. "This is all wonderful, of course," she said, her voice a little too sharp, breaking the solemn atmosphere. "But can we just cut to the chase, Mr. Davies? Beverly has generously agreed to help us with the down payment for our house." A slow, deliberate smile spread across Mr. Davies's face. It did not reach his eyes. "Precisely, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "That is exactly why we are here, to get to the chase, and to begin. I have a recording I believe you all should hear." He reached into his briefcase again, placed a small, sleek digital recorder in the absolute center of the table, and with a final pointed look at Sarah, pressed the play button. Sarah's own voice filled the silent room, each honeyed word now a weapon turned against her. "It would be best for the children not to be exposed to this kind of negativity and selfishness. They won't be visiting you anymore, not until you decide to show that you actually care about this family's future." The click of the recording ending was as loud as a gunshot in the tomb-like quiet. The air in the room had frozen solid. Eleanor's jaw was slack, her smug reptilian expression wiped clean, replaced by a mask of disbelief. Jacob's face was ashen, a deathly pale. He turned to look at me, truly look at me for the first time that day, and I saw not just shock, but a genuine, dawning horror in his eyes. He had heard the blackmail in his wife's voice, and he knew it was the truth. Sarah was the first to recover, her panic manifesting as a shrill, defensive rage. "What is this? This is illegal. You recorded me without my consent. It's been edited, it's been doctored. I never said that." She glared at Mr. Davies, then at me, her eyes wild with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. "This is what you do? You scheme and plot behind our backs? No wonder we needed space." Mr. Davies didn't flinch. He let her tirade hang in the air for a moment, its desperation echoing off the polished walls. He then calmly reached into his briefcase and retrieved the thick, bound report from the investigator, placing it on the table with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to silence her mid-sentence. "Perhaps this wasn't doctored, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice level and dangerously calm. He opened the report, the rustle of the heavy paper the only sound in the room. "Let's review," he began, his tone that of a professor delivering a lecture to a failing class. "Combined credit card debt across 7 major cards, $122,400. Outstanding personal loans from 3 different online lenders, $35,000. Rent arrears on your luxury apartment, 4 months totaling $16,000. Now, for the expenditures." He began to flip through the pages, his voice a relentless, damning monotone. "A weekend trip to a spa in Nantucket in August, $6,000. A designer handbag purchased on September 12th from a boutique on Newberry Street, $4,200. A ski vacation in Aspen for New Year's, booked 3 weeks ago with a non-refundable deposit, $14,000. He paused, looking directly at Sarah, whose face had gone from red with rage to a ghostly white. "And of course," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "the monthly gifts to your mother, Miss Eleanor Vance, totaling over $20,000 in the last year." He then slid a single printed email across the table. It was the one I had seen, the one that had turned my anger to ice. Sarah stared at her own words, a digital confession of her intent. "As soon as the old woman signs the papers for the trust, all our problems will be solved." "This," Mr. Davies said, tapping the paper with a single, manicured finger, "seems quite clear." He then produced 2 final documents, placing my own bank statement next to Sarah's credit card bill, side by side. Here's the most interesting part. On October 5th, my client, Mrs. Hayes, transferred $3,000 to your joint account for what you described as emergency dental work for your daughter. On October 6th, this charge for $4,200 for a Cecilia Bardeen handbag appears on your statement. A remarkable coincidence. He leaned back in his chair, the evidence laid bare on the polished wood between them. The trap was sprung. The silence was absolute, broken only by a small, choked sound from Jacob. "But that is not all," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning, cutting through the suffocating tension. "Mr. Davies, please show them the will." Mr. Davies's pen moved across the paper, and with a few strokes of ink, the entire future they had planned dissolved into nothing. He took the original copy of my will, dated 2019, a thick document bound in a handsome blue cover, and placed it in the center of the table. "This," he announced, his voice echoing in the tense silence that had fallen over the room, "is what you stood to inherit. The entirety of the Hayes estate, to be managed and eventually passed down by you, Mr. Hayes." He let the statement hang in the air, a phantom of a fortune they could almost touch. I saw Sarah's eyes fix on the document, a flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph crossing her face. Then, Mr. Davies produced a second, thinner document, its pages stark white and clinical. "And this," he said, his voice hardening, "is the amended and restated last will and testament of Beverly Hayes, signed and notarized 2 days ago." He unfolded it, cleared his throat, and began to read with the dispassionate tone of a judge delivering a verdict. Article 3, Section 2 is hereby revoked and replaced as follows. "I intentionally make no provision in this will for my son, Jacob Hayes, nor for his wife, Sarah Hayes, nor for her mother, Eleanor Vance, due to their sustained course of actions causing significant emotional and financial distress to me, the testator." A strangled gasp escaped from Eleanor. Sarah's face, once pale with shock, was now turning a blotchy, furious red. Mr. Davies continued, his voice unwavering, a relentless tide of legal finality. "The entirety of the estate shall be liquidated and placed into the newly formed Arthur Hayes Charitable Trust. From this trust, a separate educational fund will be established for my grandchildren, Leo Hayes and Maya Hayes." I looked at the names of my grandchildren, safely enshrined in the legal text, their futures protected not just with money, but from the greed of their own parents. I thought of Arthur's quiet insistence on protecting the innocent. His wish was finally being honored. "This educational fund," Mr. Davies elaborated, looking directly at Jacob, his voice leaving no room for negotiation, "will be managed by an independent third-party trustee at Boston First Bank and will be inaccessible to any guardian until each child reaches the age of 25. The remainder of the trust's assets, the vast majority of the estate, will be immediately dispersed to a list of charitable organizations, including the Boston Children's Hospital and the Greater Boston Food Bank." "No!" Sarah finally exploded, slamming her hands on the table with a force that made the water glasses jump. "You can't do this, you cruel, vindictive old woman, after everything we've done for you." Eleanor tried a different tactic, her voice a strained, wheedling plea. "Jonathan, this is clearly the result of undue influence, of a mother in a fragile state. As a family, we can discuss—" "There is nothing left to discuss, Eleanor." Mr. Davies cut her off, his voice like ice. "Your names have been removed." Throughout it all, Jacob had remained utterly still, his gaze fixed on the table as if trying to bore a hole through the polished wood. Now he slowly lifted his head. His eyes filled not with anger, but with a hollow, bottomless despair. "You took everything, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. I met his gaze, my own heart aching but resolute. "No, Jacob," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "I only took back what you were never truly entitled to in the first place, my trust." The sound of a chair scraping back was violent. Sarah was on her feet, screaming incoherently, a torrent of insults and threats that filled the room with venom. Mr. Davies calmly picked up the phone on the credenza. "Security to the 25th floor conference room, please." As 2 uniformed guards appeared at the door to escort them out, the shouting and crying faded down the hall. When the heavy door clicked shut, sealing them out of my life, Mr. Davies turned to me. "Now, Mrs. Hayes," he said, a hint of a genuine smile returning to his face, "let us begin the work of rebuilding Arthur's true legacy." News of the generosity of the Arthur Hayes Charitable Trust spread faster than wildfire, and for some, it burned everything to the ground. It began 2 weeks after the meeting in Mr. Davies's office, a meeting that now felt like a lifetime ago. The Boston Herald ran a feature in its Sunday lifestyle section, complete with a photograph of me standing beside the director of the city's largest food bank, a place Arthur and I had quietly supported for years. The headline read, "Hayes Widow Endows Community with Family Inheritance." I stared at the photo, at the genuine, tearful gratitude on the director's face as I handed her the first ceremonial check, and felt not triumph, but a quiet, profound sense of peace. I wondered if Jacob had seen it. I poured my energy into this new purpose, a purpose Arthur had unknowingly prepared for me. I spent my days not waiting by the phone for calls that would never come, but meeting with the boards of the charities he had chosen so carefully. For the first time, I saw the full, staggering impact of the wealth we had lived without. I was helping to fund a new pediatric wing at the hospital, stocking the shelves of a dozen food pantries across the state, and providing scholarships for children who had nothing but their own fierce intelligence. The hollow space left by my family's betrayal was slowly being filled, not with anger, but with the quiet satisfaction of making a tangible difference. The work was healing. It was the legacy Arthur had truly intended. Mr. Davies called me at the end of the month with an update. His voice was all business, but I could detect a note of grim satisfaction beneath the legal jargon. "The house of cards is falling, Beverly," he said. "Jacob and Sarah have received a formal eviction notice from their landlord. The car has been repossessed, and I'm told at least 3 of their credit card companies have initiated lawsuits for non-payment." He paused, and I could hear the rustle of papers on his end. "And Eleanor has apparently washed her hands of the whole affair. She's not answering their calls. It seems her loyalty was as transactional as her daughter's." I felt a pang of something, not pity for them, but a deep, sorrowful ache for the son I had raised, now abandoned by the very people he had betrayed me for. He had chosen his new family, and they had discarded him the moment he was no longer useful. A week later, a letter arrived. The envelope was cheap, the address scrawled in Jacob's angry, slanted handwriting. There was no apology. There was no remorse. It was a torrent of blame, 4 pages of vitriol. He accused me of destroying his life, of humiliating him in front of everyone he knew, of choosing strangers over my own blood. He wrote that the children were suffering, that it was my fault they now lived in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city. He said I had always been selfish, always holding my money and my sacrifices over his head, and that this final act was just the ultimate proof. I read the letter once, then twice. The words that would have once shattered me, that would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt, now felt like pebbles hitting a brick wall. He still didn't understand. He saw the money as his right, my love as his due, and his consequences as my fault. The man who wrote this letter was a stranger to me, a ghost created by greed and entitlement. I walked over to the fireplace, the same one Arthur and I had sat beside on countless winter nights, sharing our hopes and dreams. I crumpled the letter into a tight ball, the angry words silenced within my fist. Then I tossed it into the flames and watched it burn, the paper blackening and turning to ash, disappearing into nothing. A year passed. My life found a new, peaceful rhythm. The charities thrived. The house was quiet. The pain had softened into a scar, a part of my story, but no longer its focus. And then, on a rainy April afternoon, as I was signing off on a new round of grants, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but somehow I knew exactly who it was. The voice on the other end of the line was no longer that of a demanding man, but of a lost boy. I was in my office at the foundation, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across a wall of photographs, not of my family, but of smiling children at the hospital wing we'd funded, of grateful faces at the food bank, of families moving into newly built shelters. For the past year, this work had been my sanctuary, a place where I could build something new from the wreckage of the old. I was reviewing a grant proposal for a local after-school arts program when the phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I almost ignored it, as I often did, but some instinct made me answer with the professional calm I'd acquired. Arthur Hayes Trust. This is Beverly. There was a long pause, filled with a hesitant, ragged breath that was instantly, painfully familiar. Mom? The voice was thin, stripped of all its former arrogance, all its entitlement. It was Jacob. I remained silent, my hand gripping a pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sounds of the office, the distant hum of traffic, the soft clicking of a keyboard in the next room, faded into a dull roar. He took my silence as permission to continue, the words tumbling out in a broken, quiet rush, as if he feared I would hang up at any moment. He told me about the past year. He didn't ask for money, he didn't make demands, he just told me. He spoke of working 2 jobs, one stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight, the other driving for a ride-share service on weekends until his back ached. "My hands, Mom," he said, and I could hear the strange wonder in his voice. They're cracked and sore all the time. I never knew what real work felt like. He talked about how Sarah had left him 6 months ago, after a final screaming argument in which she called him a pathetic failure for losing the golden goose. She had packed her designer bags and disappeared into the night, leaving him alone with the children and a mountain of debt he was slowly, painfully chipping away at. He told me about raising Leo and Maya on his own in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the sirens never seemed to stop and the rent was always a day away from being late. "I think," he said, his voice cracking, the sound of a man utterly broken, "I think I finally understand how you must have felt, raising me alone after Dad died." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, a callback to a lifetime of sacrifice he had never once acknowledged. I was weak, Mom. I was greedy. I let her and her mother convince me that what we were doing was right, that we were entitled to it because you had it and we didn't. I was a fool, and I was a coward. The confession hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. It was the first honest thing he had said to me in years. He wasn't making excuses. He was simply stating the facts of his own moral bankruptcy. Then, after another long, heavy pause, he made his request, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a shame so profound I could feel it through the phone. "Mom, could I bring the kids to see you? I'm not asking for anything, I swear. I just want them to know their grandmother." I said nothing. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. In my mind, a kaleidoscope of images flashed. Sarah's sneering face in the conference room, the cold finality in her voice as she blackmailed me, the angry, entitled words in Jacob's last letter, the scar tissue over that wound pulled tight, a visceral reminder of the need to protect myself. But then, other images pushed through. Leo's bright, curious eyes, Maya's sweet, trusting smile, Arthur's voice from a distant memory telling me to always protect the innocent. My grandchildren were the innocent ones here, caught in a war they hadn't started. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice finally breaking the silence steady and clear. "The park, the one by the river, just you and the children. We'll start there." Watching Leo and Maya run toward me across the sun-drenched grass of the public park, I knew there were things more precious than any will. For a year, I had only seen them in old photographs, their smiles frozen in time. Now they were real, a whirlwind of bright jackets and breathless laughter, their small legs pumping as they closed the distance between us. I knelt on the cool grass, my arms open, and they crashed into me with the force of a happy memory. Maya buried her face in my shoulder, her small hands clutching my coat, while Leo just looked at me, his eyes wide and curious, as if trying to place me. "Grandma?" he asked, his voice a small, uncertain whisper. "Yes, sweet boy," I said, my own voice thick with tears I refused to shed. "It's me." Jacob stood 20 feet away, a ghost at the edge of our reunion. He looked thinner, worn down by a year of hard consequences. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple, clean jacket and jeans. He didn't approach. He just watched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, a silent, solitary figure against the backdrop of happy families playing on the swings. For the next hour, I gave my full attention to the children. We fed the ducks at the pond. I pushed Maya on the swings until she shrieked with delight, and Leo showed me how high he could climb on the jungle gym. It was easy, natural. The love was still there, an unbroken thread connecting us. Jacob remained on the periphery, a satellite orbiting our small, happy world, never intruding, his expression a mixture of shame and something that looked like longing. At one point, Leo wandered into a patch of clover, picked a single scraggly daisy, and ran back to me. "For you, Grandma," he said, pressing the small flower into my palm with all the seriousness of a grand gesture. My breath caught in my throat. It was the exact same way Arthur had first offered me a wildflower all those years ago on our first walk. He'd been nervous, fumbling, just a boy with grease on his hands and hope in his eyes. I closed my hand around the small gift, the memory a sweet, sharp ache. As the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long, golden shadows, it was time to go. The children ran to Jacob, and I watched him kneel to help Maya with her shoe, his movements gentle and patient. He was a good father, at least. That much was true. As they prepared to leave, he finally walked over to me, stopping a few feet away, the distance feeling like a chasm. He still couldn't meet my eyes. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the evening breeze. It was just 3 words, but they held the weight of 1,000 apologies he didn't know how to say. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the arrogant man in the lawyer's office, but the broken pieces of the boy I had raised. He was learning, the hard way. "Next week," I said, my voice steady, "here again, but the week after that, bring them home." Redemption, I've learned, is not a single apology spoken in a moment of despair. It is a long, quiet journey, and it has no final destination. The next few months settled into a new, fragile rhythm. The weekly meetings in the park evolved into Sunday afternoons at my house. The children's laughter once again filled the rooms, and I would bake their favorite oatmeal cookies. Jacob was always there, quiet and respectful. He would help me in the garden, his hands, once soft from an office job, now calloused and capable. He never asked for anything. He never stayed for dinner. He would just bring the children and, at the end of the day, take them back to his small apartment. The first hint of his journey came not from him, but from Maria, the director of the Greater Boston Food Bank. It was during one of our routine calls about the foundation's quarterly grant. "By the way, Beverly," she said, her voice warm, "I wanted to thank you for sending us that new volunteer on Saturdays. A quiet man, but he works harder than anyone. His name is Jacob." My heart skipped a beat. He had never told me. He wasn't doing it for my approval. He was doing it for himself. That single unspoken act meant more than any apology he could ever voice. He finally asked the question one Sunday evening in late summer, after the children had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted from an afternoon of running through the sprinklers. He was standing by the door, his car keys in his hand, ready to leave. "Mom," he began, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the floor, "is there a way back? For me? A way to earn my place again?" I looked at the man my son was becoming, a man humbled by consequences, a man rebuilding his own foundation, brick by painful brick. I walked over to him, not with the anger of the past, but with the quiet clarity of the present. "Continue on the path you are on, Jacob," I said softly, "not to impress me, but to become a man your own children can be proud of. Prove the change with actions, not with words." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. "Perhaps one day the children's trust will need a manager who can be trusted." He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just nodded, his shoulders shaking as a single tear traced a path down his cheek. He understood. The offer wasn't about money. It was about honor, a chance to reclaim the one thing he had so thoroughly lost. I watched my son walk away, a man on the long, hard road to finding himself. I did not know what the future held, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt hope. Not a hope in him, but a hope in the power of change, and in the healing that time, however slowly, can bring. The smell of coffee fills my kitchen this morning, and for the first time in years, it's a scent of peace, not anxious waiting. I've learned the hardest lesson. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, but the ultimate act of self-respect. True family is not an entitlement based on blood. It is a bond that must be earned through loyalty and love. The quiet in my home is no longer lonely. It is liberating. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own peace?